Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online panel named The Coronavirus Pandemic as a Litmus Test for Capitalist Modernity. We're very, very excited and proud and happy to have been able to put together this lineup of speakers. We will try and address many of the questions and many of the issues that people have been thinking about over the last few months. And of course, potentially this session may give rise for more questions than answers, but that's also one of our aims today. Before I get into the introduction and introducing our amazing speakers, just some housekeeping. So please, as usual, if you're not a panelist, please try and keep your cameras off and yourself muted. And also our speakers today will be muted and not have their cameras on while other speakers are presenting. And the format that we'll try and stick to today, and I'm going to be, and this is very unlike me, but I'm going to try and be a very harsh moderator today, and it is so we can make enough time for questions and answers as possible. So our speakers will present for a maximum of 15 minutes, and then we will give way for questions. So we will put at least 15 minutes, but potentially half an hour towards questions, and then try and wrap up. Now, this panel is a part of a series put together by the Network for Women Weaving the Future, and it's also a follow-on from a conference that was put on in Hamburg a couple of years ago called Revolution in the Making. And today is the second panel session. We also have a webinar series, and all of these can be found on the Women Weaving Future website, and also can be found on the Jenny, so CENI social media accounts as well. And also we will try and show upcoming sessions also at the end of this session too. So yeah, please stay tuned for those, and stay with us. Also, please ask questions all throughout the panel. We have some of our friends who are going to be accumulating the questions, and then we will ask the relevant questions to speakers. So as much as possible, please direct your question to a specific speaker, but also you're more than welcome to ask general questions. We will try and also put together running themes in terms of questions and also comments, and try and address them as much as possible. So I think a lot of people agree that this global pandemic has exposed the state as a structure of organization and capitalism as inherently anti-society. From the effects of the pandemic and also from the identified effects or factors that also cause the pandemic to hit particular communities or particular sections of society harder than many others. And, you know, we've seen the mass scale unemployment, and also what's been confirmed once again is things like unemployment and bad healthcare, and also state surveillance and so on. These are very ideological and political choices that the state makes, and not that is in the favor of society. So today we'll try and address how have states across the world used the pandemic as an opportunity for more power and war. How has this affected communities, particularly women, and what do they have to say about the future? So without further ado, I want to make sure there's enough time for our amazing speakers. So we have Harsha Walia, who is an organizer and author based in Vancouver, Canada. She is the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism and the co-founder of anti-colonial and feminist migrant justice group No One Is Illegal. And then we have Camille Barbagallo, who is an organizer with the Women's Strike Assembly, For the last 3 years, she has been developing political and industrial strategies that focus on women's work, both paid and unpaid. She works at the University of Leeds, and her research focuses on the political economy of reproduction. She is the editor of Women and the Subversion of the Community, Mariosa Dalla Costa Reader, and co-editor of Commoning, and with George Kafansis and Silvia Federici. She currently lives in the Suffolk countryside and is learning the highs and lows of growing food in the English climate. Before migrating to the UK, she lived in Australia and worked as a trade union organizer and campaigned to end the mandatory detention of asylum seekers and to close the camps. She is a founding member of the radical political organization Plan C. We also have Maryanne Cocina, who is a social justice political activist. She is the convener of the Women in Social Justice Centers in Kenya and the co-founder of Kayola Community Justice Center. We also have Ayse Gökkan, who is a spokesperson of the Free Women's Movement in North Kurdistan and also works as a women's activist in and across Turkey, and is joining us today in a very difficult climate where it's becoming increasingly hard to organize it politically in any capacity. So that's going to be our running order. And so I will ask our other speakers to close their cameras, and so will I, and I will give Harsha 15 minutes for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all, and good morning where I am. It's 10 a.m. Thank you so much for organizing this, for everyone who's participating, and it's such an honor to be here on this internationalist panel alongside so many other fabulous speakers. I'm here in Vancouver, which is unceded Coast Salish territories. You may know it as Vancouver. This is the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, the indigenous peoples of these lands. And of course, settler colonialism is very much a part of the Canadian reality. I'm also really excited to speak on this event, particularly because in the international kind of scene, Canada is often left off of conversations around state organization and violence. And that's partly because of the myth of Canada being, for lack of a better word, kind of better than other places. And so for me, it's always really important to be able to present about what's happening in Canada and to very much locate it on a spectrum of the ways in which the state and capitalism is organized. I will give a brief overview, and I look forward to conversation about the ways in which the pandemic, as the introduction suggested, has exacerbated state and capitalist violence, particularly for women and gender diverse people and queer and trans people, so with a particularly gendered lens on it. But I'll start by saying that for me, when I'm talking about the state and talking about capitalism, I locate kind of the primary structuring as racial capitalism, which Cedric Robinson, the great Black Marxist, talks about racial capitalism as not just race and capitalism, but as foundationally organized through each other. And that is very much the reality in Canada when thinking through the impacts of the pandemic. And the other piece that I'll say, flowing from the idea of racial capitalism, is following on Ruth Gilmore, the Black abolitionist, who talks about state violence in the context of racial capitalism as kind of having two trajectories. One is organized abandonment and the other is organized violence. And so one being the kind of politics of austerity and the other being the carceral state, and that those are inseparable, right? So the communities who are most impacted by organized abandonment, lack of services, social services, and again, the politics of austerity, are the same communities who are most impacted by overt state violence, and that those are inseparable. The idea of being underprotected and over-policed are inseparable politics of state violence. So in the pandemic, what has all of this meant in Canada, particularly through a gendered lens? So a few quick things. One is, of course, that the entire kind of infrastructure and the impact of the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women in a number of different ways. One is, of course, that women, particularly women of color, are overrepresented in the workforce who are classified as essential workers. And now we know that the idea of essential workers is really workers who are disposable and expendable. So those who are put most at harm in the context of the pandemic, who are not granted sick leave, who are not able to work from home. So essential becoming a code for, workers who are disposable and face high risk of contracting COVID. And so women, particularly women of color, are overrepresented in the care sector, the deeply underpaid care sector across the world, but particularly in Canada. And within that, of course, women bear a particular burden in care work as it comes to domestic work. So health workers as essential workers, retail workers as essential workers, women in service work, and then also particularly women in the domestic work. And what this has meant is that women, particularly immigrant women who come to Canada as migrant domestic workers from the Philippines and from Indonesia, are now facing the reality of the increased burden of domestic work in households where upper class, middle class, rich women have been able to rely on the domestic labor of immigrant women, right? So the ways in which the kind of global chains of care have expanded across borders. And so they face an added burden with the lack of schools being open, et cetera, to take care of children, while at the same time now facing far more extreme conditions of precarity, unemployment, of precarity, and being overworked and being underpaid. The added kind of violence that domestic workers, particularly migrant domestic workers, are facing is that a number of them were actually out of the country when the pandemic hit. And they were out of the country because they were with the Canadian families that they work for. And when Canada closed its borders, as a result of the pandemic, a number of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, ended up actually stranded in countries all around the world. And Canada refused to bring them back into Canada. So Canadians who were stranded abroad were brought back into Canada after the border closed. But a number of migrant domestic workers in particular who were working for and with these Canadian families were stranded in places like, in resorts in Mexico that of course they can't afford, and other places. So there's been a concerted effort to ensure that Canada actually allows these workers to be able to come back in. The other impact in the pandemic for women in Canada is the targeting of particularly elderly Asian women. So the kind of racist hysteria around the coronavirus pandemic and the anti-Asian hysteria has had a really stark impact for elderly Asian women in this country who are subjected to higher levels of hate crimes now. And then the other impact is, of course, the increase, which we're seeing around the world, the increase in gendered violence. So, state violence is, of course, always gendered violence, and then also interpersonal gendered violence. And so the rates of calls that are going into crisis lines, to domestic violence centers, those numbers are increased as people are forced to shelter in place, are forced to stay in abusive homes, et cetera. So that's a kind of general overview of the impacts of the pandemic. And then within that, there's even further stratifications, again, depending on race, immigration status, sexuality, class, and more. And so I want to touch on those briefly. I talked a little bit about domestic migrant workers. The impact, one of the populations in Canada that's most impacted by COVID are migrant workers in general. And so in Canada, when I say migrant workers, of course, there are many immigrant workers, there's many undocumented workers. Migrant workers are a very specific category of workers who elsewhere we would know as guest workers. So people who are legally in Canada, but are essentially indentured workers, right? So the ways in which the state manages migration, when an employer no longer needs that labor, they're deported out. So a very contingent labor force that is always deportable and exploitable. And so migrant workers across Canada have some of the highest rates of COVID. And, a few things stand out here. One is, as I was mentioning earlier, borders are closed, and Canada is one of the 57 countries that has closed its borders in the wake of the pandemic, including to people seeking asylum and refugees. And so that means the border has been closed to international students, to refugees, to asylum seekers, to various kinds of visa stratifications. But the two kinds of flights that continue to operate out of Canada are deportation flights. So deportation flights continuing to deport people out to other countries and exporting the virus out. And the second is flights bringing in migrant workers. So again, particularly to ensure that low-wage exploitable workers, including many women, are able to continue to serve the racial capitalist economy and are continue to able to serve state interests when it comes to food supply chains and low wage work. And so within this, farm workers in particular, including women workers on the farms, have some of the highest rates of COVID in the country because, of course, farm workers are continuing to work. They're often housed in incredibly crammed conditions, sometimes 97 people in some cases in one home, employer provided accommodations. And on one farm in particular, over 3/4 of all farm workers have contracted the virus, but are not receiving adequate medical attention and have to continue to work for their bosses. So that's the particular impact on migrant workers. The other is prisoners, including women and gender diverse people who are imprisoned. So prisoners are the second most impacted population other than seniors in care homes, who are impacted by the spread of COVID. And of course, incarceration is always state violence. In the context of the pandemic, the incarceration also means that people have no means of safe distancing, of hygiene and safety protocols. And despite constant social movements calling for the release of incarcerated people and for the abolition of the carceral infrastructure, prisoners continue to be incarcerated in federal and provincial prisons and jails in Canada. And women have some of the highest rates of COVID. And so we see on the one hand, the ways in which the state has in continuing to entrench state violence, right? Where the carceral state infrastructure, like prisons, like carceral temporary foreign worker programs, these are continuing under COVID. The other thing that we're seeing, speaking of carceral institutions, is the general policing of the pandemic. So in Canada, in the first 100 days of the kind of spike, so the first 3 months of the spike of the pandemic, there was 10,000 COVID-related charges. So these are charges related to the pandemic where people have been fined for not following social distancing measures, right? So the general surveillance that the pandemic has ushered in and the pretext that it has allowed, as we've seen across the world, for increased state surveillance and state policing has happened in Canada. People have racked up over $13 million in fines, which of course, for poor people and low-income people and oppressed people who cannot pay it, we're waiting to see, but of course it is predictable that many of these people will end up in the criminal justice system, in the criminal legal system. And of those 10,000 charges, they were disproportionately, unsurprisingly levied against Black and Indigenous and homeless people in this country. And so that's, just in 3 short months, the policing of the pandemic has ushered in this kind of policing, and this overt policing on the streets is accompanied by digital surveillance, contact tracing apps, all of those kinds of other auxiliary methods of state surveillance that we're seeing. The last thing that I wanted to mention that is particular, it's not unique to Canada, but that really we're going through right now, is the overdose crisis. So the COVID pandemic is a public health emergency in Canada. It's been declared a public health emergency, and health resources have been marshaled in a country which is often lauded for its universal public health care. particularly in relationship to, say, the United States. But we're also in another public health emergency, and that has been declared as one, which is the overdose crisis, the opioid crisis. And there are more people dying of the opioid crisis in Canada, particularly in BC, where I'm located, than are dying of COVID. But because the opioid crisis is stigmatized, particularly against people who use drugs, is a stigma against overwhelmingly Indigenous people who, for whom, the opioid crisis is another form of genocide in a long legacy of settler colonialism in this country. So for viewers who are watching from elsewhere, Canada is very much a settler colonial state, underwritten by state violence and genocide against Indigenous people on these lands when European colonists came and, quote unquote, claimed Canada. And so that has continued through many forms of violence. And the overdose crisis is one symptom of that, of intergenerational trauma. And so this overdose crisis that impacts people who use drugs, overwhelmingly Indigenous people, some of the highest proportions of overdose fatalities are Indigenous women, people who are poor and live on the streets, who are street involved. This overdose crisis has been eclipsed by the COVID pandemic. And so, we're just seeing such high levels of death. And again, of organized abandonment alongside organized violence following Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that's impacting disproportionately oppressed communities in this country. I see my video has gone, which means my time is up, but that's just some of the ways in which state violence has continued under the pretext of the pandemic, and really that some of the markers of state violence across race, gender, class, caste, and more continue to be exacerbated under the pandemic. Thank you all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Harsha. I think, so much, you were able to raise so much in 15 minutes that I don't think I will really be able to do a very good job in summarizing. But I think one of the most horrific the points that you made was, the issue of, guest workers. So a contingent labor force that is always deportable. So therefore, deporting the virus and then importing more workers, essentially, of course, treating other human beings as just disposable, just bodies of labor. And also, I think one of the things that needs to be reminded all the time and as often as possible is that it's not race and capitalism, but racial capitalism, and and capitalism is necessarily racial, and it just simply can't function any other way, actually. But also the heightening and the further depth of violence against women in many, many different forms and many different capacities. And also, I think perhaps one of the most key running themes that we're probably going to see running through all of the interventions today is the necessity of acknowledging that borders are anti-human, and that there is no other way with that. So again, without further ado, I want to pass it over to Camille, and for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Kurdish Women's Movement for this opportunity to contribute to the discussion today. It's a real honor to be here. So I kind of wanted to talk about COVID-19 and how it has been and continues to be a crisis of social reproduction. And I wanted to touch on quite a lot of the same kind of topics and issues that Harsha was just discussing in a Canadian context, because I think we're seeing similar kind of dynamics playing out across quite a number of different global north countries. The things I want to kind of focus on today is about thinking about the National Health Service here and who got to become heroes and who didn't get to become heroes and who we clapped for every Thursday night. And I also want to think about food and agriculture and and how that kind of touches on to a kind of much broader kind of crisis around survival. And also what's kind of emerged as one of these kind of key kind of issues that's certainly not going to go away is this question around care and education, and the role of care and the role of the education system, and how it functions within the capitalist economy. And then briefly, I just want to think about the family a little bit and come in and think about some of the kind of things that have been revealed about the nuclear family under capitalist modes of production. And then kind of some short kind of thoughts on where we go from here as the kind of international feminist movement. So when I talk about social reproduction, usually I'm talking about all the work that occurs in society in a global kind of context, that usually I talk about it as the kind of all the cooking and the cleaning and the caring. It's work that is both paid and is both unpaid. And I think that COVID-19 has shone an incredible light on this kind of cluster of work in both its kind of paid iterations, in terms of there's been a constant conversation about work over the last 4 months, and also in its unpaid iterations. It's also reproductive work, is work and a kind of terrain of life that feminists in lots of different contexts, and actually for a really long time, have been trying to revalue, have been trying to examine and trying to bring center stage, so as to be able to say and understand better how capitalist economies actually function. So one of the first lessons I think around COVID-19 for me and for lots of other women who've been organizing around this for a really long time, turns out that being right about gender and value and race and class isn't enough. It's not enough to have the right analysis, because we've, I think, really seen that the pandemic has brought a whole range of different systems to their knees really quickly. So I wanted to think about, in the UK, there's been a bunch of workers who've been designated key workers. I think Harsha was talking about them as essential workers. And that's certainly when it comes to the British context, we've been able to valorize and make posters, and there's been this weekly standing out on people's doorsteps, clapping for the NHS, who were understood to be a bunch of workers, all of them involved in the medical profession, regardless of whether or not the people, there were only certain people who were being clapped for. And in a similar way to how kind of in the old normal, before COVID, there were only some workers who could be considered real or legitimate or important workers. I think there was some really interesting kind of forms of violence around making one very specific set of workers visible, i.e. medical workers in the NHS, that in and of itself made a whole variety of other people invisible. So by them, I'm talking about even just if we stay with hospitals, like people who were cleaning the hospitals, or people who were making food off site, so people could continue to eat in hospitals. And I think that there's something quite profound about being unable to make everyone visible at the same time when it comes to reproduction. And so I think in terms of this question around visibility and invisibility, and it's I think a very similar context to Canada, in terms of there was a huge effort to keep everybody alive during the first few months of the pandemic, but only some people could be kind of romanticized and valorized for their sacrifice. So supermarket workers, cleaners, people involved in food production or agriculture certainly weren't celebrated in the same kind of way as the NHS. And I think it's interesting to think about why that is. In terms of food production and thinking about food production, I think this is probably the first time in many generations, probably since the Second World War, that in Britain we had the first kind of glimpse of or experience of food shortages. I certainly have never in the couple of decades that I've been alive gone to the supermarket and experienced empty shelves. That's something that the global north hasn't had to experience. But I think it's really important that we make sure we learn the right lessons as we're trying to think through what's happened over the last 4 months, because obviously the contradictions were immediately present when we think about food and how we survived. And who didn't survive. In that food distribution, the problem wasn't a lack of food, it was a problem of a lack of food distribution, which is actually a problem that has plagued global political economy well before the pandemic. And that there was this question about, until we have the will and the political purpose about putting our lives and survival at the center, we'll end up with answers and solutions like what we've seen over the last 4 months. Obviously, there was, in a very similar way to Canada, the British labour market is entirely dependent on migrant labour, and that migrant labour is really heavily concentrated in the agricultural sector. And so we saw one of a really profound kind of contradiction emerge really quickly, where there was millions of people made unemployed at the same time as there being a real need for labour in the agricultural sector that was all of a sudden put into turmoil because of the closure of borders or the disruption to migrationary journeys that the agricultural sector very much relies upon. And I think in a story that's very similar around the world because of how food production now exists in a global kind of context, we see really terrible conditions in a racialized workforce all across the country, and the inability for capital and the state to be able to take British labour, British workers, and use them in the agricultural sector. And I think there's something incredibly instructive in that. The answer is obviously to increase wages and conditions so that it's a better job, and that not to continue to allow a race to the bottom where only people without dependents or people who aren't able to access the labour market in other ways are forced to take that work. And we see that kind of pattern of reproductive work and the kind of devaluing of reproductive work kind of playing out in the care sector as well. And these are all industries and sectors that have obviously always been functioning and in some ways have been backstage for so much of the kind of story of capitalist production, and have and the COVID-19 pandemic has done something where there's been an inversion where previously work that was devalued, kept hidden, supposedly that anybody could do it, that it wasn't really that important. It was definitely classified by the state here as unskilled work. All of a sudden has moved to the center of kind of political economy and also how we organize, and has raised a whole range of different questions. And certainly the care sector has probably animated and been at the center of so many of these discussions because of just how essential care work is, both to the economy and also to keeping people alive. We saw that in care homes here in the UK that were absolutely decimated and ravished by the virus, and a real sense, in a similar way, I think, to Canada, where there's a politics playing out between a politics of abandonment and a politics of austerity. And I think that those two intersecting sets of kind of government ideologies have really come to bear on how this pandemic has carried out. I wanted to focus a little bit today on the issue of childcare and the education system, because in lots of countries, not all of them, but in lots of them, we've seen the school system close down or overwhelmingly closed down, and we've also seen childcare centres close down. And in some ways, the kind of feminist drum of wanting to talk about care, wanting to talk about how important things like childcare and education are, has been totally made visible and brought center stage. what I think's been really interesting is that at the same time as health workers and the labour that they have done and contributed to this pandemic has been valorised and celebrated, and rightly so, the work of care has kind of concurrently been massively devalued. And I think that we can see that by the fact that for a huge amount of families, they were just required to absorb the untold hours during the day of looking after their children, while at the same time still being required to work. And so that obviously has been an issue for people who've had to work at home and look after their children. And it's also been an issue for people who've had to continue to work outside of the home, but without any of the state or care support that they previously had. And I think that before I get on to where I think we should go in terms of these kind of questions around organizing, I think that COVID-19 has really clearly illustrated some of the dualities and some of the contradictions of the nuclear family under capital, in terms of it didn't take long, and if you thought about it for more than 2 seconds, you would understand how the home was not a safe haven for lots of people. It was not a place of security and comfort. It can be those things, and it certainly has been for lots of people who've been able to. In the UK, we've had government programs where people have been furloughed and able to be paid, and so there's such an uneven experience of this institution of the nuclear family. And I think that without any state support, we can see the nuclear family as the kind of violent institution that it has always historically been and will continue to be under this kind of gendered and race and classed kind of configuration. And in that way, I think we need to really think about the nuclear family, because as not that there will necessarily be an immediate, like this pandemic isn't going anywhere for quite a while, I think, but also that in some ways this is a test run for the coming ecological crises that we are going to face. And if the nuclear family is the only institution where all of social life and survival gets pushed onto, then we as the international feminist movement need to think about what we can say and do to kind of undo some of the kind of violences that is at the heart of the nuclear family. And the reason I think that's kind of difficult is that at the moment, the family is one of the only spaces of survival. And so simply making calls to abolish it isn't enough unless we have a different form of organization and a different form of thinking about how to organize collectively our survival. And I suppose just quickly to wrap up, childcare has been revealed finally to be this fundamental, crucial set of labour. In fact, I read in the New York Times this morning, I read often in the Tory-dominated press here, this kind of like awakening and realisation that shit, if we don't have childcare, then a whole bunch of people, i.e. women, can't go back to work and make value and profit for capitalists. So quick, we've got to do something about childcare. So I suppose my thinking around that is that it's great that we've been proved right, but it's not enough. It's not enough to simply reveal these sites of labour as important. We've got to do something more than come up with the answer that we want women back in the workforce as quickly as possible. The liberal feminist kind of the contradictions of liberal feminism, I think, have really come to the fore during the pandemic. Here in the UK, middle-class women were quite distraught about not being able to demand that their cleaner come in during a pandemic and clean their houses, and a whole variety of other kind of ways in which the desire to survive and succeed in the labour market has always been dependent on other women's labour. And really, this is our opportunity to come up with a different set of analysis that and a different set of action that doesn't enable one group of women to survive the pandemic at the expenses of a whole bunch of other women who've always been there doing the hard work. So I'll leave it there because that's my 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
That was so precise. Thank you very much for that, Camille. I mean, I think so many crucial points have been put forward, about care, education, the nuclear family, but also I think perhaps most crucially, what Camille has brought in this intervention is that it's not enough to say we need to get rid of these. What do we do? So like we know what we're against, and as Camille put it, we had the analysis right, but that hasn't been enough. So what do we do going forward in that sense? And also I think around the organization of food, and that in some ways, it was really well put by Camille that it's not really something that has been experienced in the global north perhaps in the way that it has, probably since World War II. So what can we do? How can organizing around food be also one of the bases of going forward, and also for politically organizing people and for political consciousness. So thank you for that. Hopefully we'll be able to address some of those further in the question and answer section. And please keep your questions coming. And again, you can ask specific questions for specific speakers, or general questions that we will either ask or for speakers to address, or perhaps put forward to the person we think is best suited to answer that. So our next speaker is Maryanne Cocina. And again, Maryanne will speak for about 15 minutes, and we will come back for Ayse after that. So Maryanne, are you here? Maryanne, do you want to put your camera on and your microphone on?
It's fine. I'm okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be on this panel.
Do you want to put your camera on and your microphone on? Maryanne, I think there's also another device in the background. I think that has the session on, and we can hear it back. There's an echo.
Okay, now it's fine. You can hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So my presentation on how capitalism has been, we've seen the failures of capitalism, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. The contradictions of capitalism have shown out clearly during this COVID-19. We can see how capitalism has really failed in both. We really don't need this capitalist system. We have to abolish it. We have to overthrow it. We have to come up with a new, different system that gives all of us equal dignity, that gives us equal rights, all of us. Because when you try to see how the NGOs, we really don't need the NGOs, because the NGOs have really messed us for so long, that come in to do the work that the government should be doing in place. So the NGOs should be, one thing should be dismantled. We do not need the NGOs. We need the equal distribution of our wealth equally, because I do not understand why we have the issue of the gap between the rich and the poor widening each and every day. Because the rich have failed to commit their class suicide. They do not want to share what they have. We have to share what we have equally. So that's how I can say, because if you try to see, like here in Kenya, the issue of police brutality, it has become a crisis, and it's not only here in Kenya. I see it's coming out internationally, the issue of police brutality. And when you try to see, like here in Kenya, most of police we have so many police stations in the informal settlements. Why? Because the system does not want the people to resist back, to get back what is theirs. That's why we have the police all over. We need to abolish the police. The police are the one making things become hard for us taking back our power, for women being on the front line and taking back what is ours, because the capitalist system, because of patriarchy structures that ours, it is not conducive for women. So we have to change the system to have a system that gives women that power. And women are the ones that run in the world. It's all that patriarchy has just taken over, has just blocked spaces for women. And women have been playing a big role, a very key role in this society and in worldwide. So we're saying we need to come up together and arise, all of us, all the world, because I think everyone is suffocating. All of us are suffocating inside our houses. We are all oppressed. All of us are oppressed. Neither the rich or the poor, all of us are oppressed as workers of this world. So it's time that we all join our hands together as the people, as workers, and say we need to abolish the capitalist system. Because we cannot continue organizing in this patriarchal system and in this capitalist system. As we've said, we do not need the NGO, so far so good. The NGO cannot continue playing the role of the government. So we need a government that is run by the people, that connect our struggles as the people. Because when you try to see my video. Okay, you can hear me? So we're saying yeah. So as we said, we really need to start organizing again as the workers of the world outside, and we need the reach, because anyway, in our organizing, we need to fund our own movement. So we need the reach to share what they have, so that we do not need the NGOs to fund us. And the way I've said the issue of police brutality, the women labor has been exploited for so many years. When women are giving birth, that is labor. But the system is killing our own children while we are so quiet, while people are so, while we have the rich that cannot even relate to the killing of young people in the informal settlement here in Kenya, because they do not feel like that is their struggle, but they should know that is our struggle, all of us. While we are dying, those are children of other women that are dying, and no woman is free until all women are free. Sex workers are dying in the hands of police. So that's what I think I can say. The capitalists, during this coronavirus pandemic, we've seen the failures of capitalism. No jobs, young people we've lost jobs. People have no jobs, no housing. We cannot access food. We cannot access basic needs that make a human being become a human being. So we cannot continue living in a world where life we do not have dignified life. People are mad, people are tired, people really want change. People want change. And it's time to go for another system. It's time to go for a socialist system that all of us are equal. All of us are equal as human beings. All of us are equal. Yeah. Those are my presentations.
Thank you very much. Maryanne, you have more time. You have about 8 more minutes. Would you like to give a few more specific examples of the experiences of the community you are living in, the experiences particularly during the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, I can continue.
Okay, you have 8 more minutes.
Okay. So I can just continue. I've said, like, we have evictions currently during this coronavirus. The issue of gender-based violence has really increased in our country. It's really rampant because, patriarchy, just told men that are head of the families, and right now they feel it's really not working out for them. They are really frustrated. They cannot provide. It's us, both of us, to acknowledge that we have a role to play, both men and women. We are not here to compete with our men. Then it's time that men acknowledge that even domestic work is work too, that people have not been acknowledging for so many years. And I just heard one of our panelists say, that we have women going to work and still coming home to still sit with their children. So women are really doing a lot. And when you try to see the capitalist system does not acknowledge the work that women really do. So when I can also say about the issue of healthcare sector, the system has privatized the healthcare sector that right now people cannot afford even healthcare, cannot access healthcare. People are dying inside their houses. Doctors have not been paid. We're asking doctors to arise. The system is really exploiting the doctors. Teachers cannot afford to be paid. Their labor is being exploited. Right now, the children in the informal settlement on the rural areas cannot afford education because it's very expensive. When they talk about online education, while people cannot even access data. So only the children of the rich will continue going to school. When you try to see the way in our country currently, the issue of teenage pregnancy is very rampant because our girls are being defiled for access of things like menstrual products, that government has made menstrual products become, menstrual products should be for free. So those are some of the issues that we have currently in our country, and these are things that people really need change. The other day we went for a march that the government tried to do as much as they could to make sure that they dispersed the march. And the march was the people's march, that they came out and said, we are tired, we're saying we want jobs, we want us to be free. We cannot continue living like this, a life that does not have dignity. We need food, we need water, we need health care. We need education that is quality to all of us and is accessible to all of us. We need our judicial sector to start working. We cannot continue having rapists in our society walking free. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Maryanne. I think some really important points have been raised, particularly around continued evictions during a global pandemic, and also actually most importantly, which is something that we don't experience of like people who live in the global north in general, is that moving education online, it only means something if you have access to internet and so on. So thank you very much for bringing all of those to the attention of everyone listening, because it's very easy for us to miss the experiences in countries like Kenya, but also all across the global south in general. So thank you very much for that perspective. And in continuation with different perspectives, we have Ayse Gökkan, as we said, who is a representative of the Free Women's Movement in Northern Kurdistan, and also is a very long-term writer, researcher, and has made documentaries, and has also taken political office in various parts of Southeast Turkey and Northern Kurdistan before. So her perspective will be very important to us. Thank you very much. Ayse, are you here? Ayse, your camera is not on.
There is a second.
I think you are connecting to, you need to connect to the audio. Huh.
Do you hear? I am here. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Okay. I will leave it to you for 15 minutes now, okay?
Okay. دست بگی از همون کسان سلام لکم زمان کردی. First of all, I want to say hi with Kurdish language, and it's okay.
Yes, it's great. You can continue.
Okay. Firstly, I wish you all a health, and I greet you all with love, and I respectful remember the women who lost their life for freedom of women and who is in prison now. Thank you very much to prepare this panel. We can share our experience with each other. And as you know, I am activist of Teja, Tevgerejin and Azat. It's in North Kurdistan and Turkey. 40 years we are struggle against man mentality in family, man authority in society, and man mentality in state. Because we are Kurdish, we are women, we are living in Kurdistan. And so when they attacked us in Turkey, if you are Kurdish, if you are woman, if you are living in Kurdistan, and attacked increasing 3 times. But we never give up from our freedom, and we are struggle against all authority who is against the woman freedom. And now I want to talk about 2 points. One is what is capitalist system and what's going on in this pandemic time, and how state and capitalism use pandemic against the society. First of all, we know capitalist modernity uses the national state like Turkey and national states like a subcontractor, a production company. And as a woman, we know capitalist modernity is money, and money is national state, and national state is man. And when we explain this, we have a many experience also. Capitalist modernity is a money, and money is God. And now capitalist system want to kill everything for money, especially in pandemic times. How we think? Because we see the state wants to kill everything for money, like ecology, freedom of women, children, and democracy, and health, law, all freedom, I mean. And according to capitalist modernity, just protect money. In Turkey, they say nobody can go out, but they will open the, big factory to make money, more money. It's they closed the life in everywhere, but they opened some factory to make money. And worker health was not important. Anything is not important except money for this mentality. For example, now in pandemic time, hospital also, they use like a factory for state. All workers are, thousands of workers, now they are, they lost their job, but special, they use hospital against people, especially in Kurdistan. 3 months, first 3 months, never make a test about pandemic. No test center even in Kurdistan. Just they say no, this pandemic and everything is in control of health ministry, and don't worry, just stay home. And when they say stay home, it means they use a word like, they say the life fits home. What does mean life fits home? It means woman has to be in home and look for children, look for old man and woman, clean the house and make service for man in home. This is the life fits home. And they want to make role of woman to take behind. When they close the woman in home, it means woman will make a service for man and look for children. And this life was going to kill it woman also. When we talk about what is going on this time, a special coronavirus at state at register and sexualism with pandemic virus. And AKP government appointed trusted Kurdish municipality also. Police and soldier, destroyed Kurdistan community. And they kill killing kids in Kurdistan. And special Turkish state sent body to mothers with cargo. They say because of coronavirus, we can't, nobody can come to take bodies. Can you imagine? And mother lost her children, and state sent body with cargo. Violence against women, it's the first example in the world, I think. State attacked hundreds of Teja activists and arrested and attacked their home, and special declaration war against women in pandemic times. Why I give all these examples? Because capitalist modernity use, like a national state, just to control women, and they use pandemic times. Why we think like this? Because we have a many practice. Women struggle against capitalist modernity, and we are anti-militarist, we are against the neoliberal politicals, economic politicals, and we want freedom of women, and we democratical and ecological life. And when we explain this, we struggle with many things. For example, before we struggle against polygamy, and really we successful about this. But capitalist modernity say yes, the polygamy is not good, but matrix, it's a romantic partner. To change name, but the result is the same. And when we struggle against honor killing, and now capitalist modernity make a new name like love killing and jealous killing, when you die, it's like a romantic dying. Killing like a romantic. The capitalist modernity use everything against woman. Special when in pandemic time, state use this time, pandemic times, against for it's like life was very dangerous, and now attacked all of the women. And when you talk about freedom, peace, and to help each other, it's terrorist. You can be terrorist. Why? Because they say everything should be in my control. And I think when we start help each other like a company, brother, family, because many people is poor and they can't go out, they can't buy anything, and children really they have take in serve. When we help each other, and states say how you can help each other, how you can share your food with each other. It's forbidden. If you help each other, it means you are terrorist. And you can see all of the newspaper right, and they attacked all homes who help each other, a special woman. And I want to say thank you to Jeune TV, because every day, without break, they press the woman center telephone number. One woman, when man attacks the woman, that telephone number in television, it was without break. Every woman can follow the telephone number. When man use violence against women, they take the telephone number from Jeune TV. Thank you for Jeune TV, I want to say. And this, of course, we have an alternative. We are not, just say, state attacked us, we are with them, and we have any chance, or we haven't any alternative. We have many alternatives to struggle against it, because capitalism and special national state use pandemic like a opportunity to control society, to attack the woman, special sexualism in Turkey, and it's going to be like a bomb. It's going to grow. Of course, against all this happening, we have many struggle with a woman in Turkey and in North Kurdistan and in the war. We should, we have a chance this time to struggle, solidarity each other in the world, because many dimension, it's in the world, we support each other and we solidarity with women special. We make a many company in this time. First, our company, because we believe our relation is a mentality relation. So we start a company like stand up for change and transformation, women's struggle. This company, it was 1 month, we never do anything, and we just continue this company. Another company, women's struggle is everywhere, because in this pandemic time, all life like education, health, home, in street, and law, many kind of life and state attacked. And that time we make this company like women's struggle is everywhere. Another company here, what is the Gulistan Doku? Because Gulistan Doku has been missing since 5 January 2020. And when we started this company, and states say, how you asked, where is the Gulistan docu? Yes, because they killed the woman and they say, nobody can ask what is going on to her and what happened. And that company was very strong in Turkey and North Kurdistan. And another company where to kill women is political strategy, because state, I mean, in a capitalist modernity, changed everything against the woman. First of all, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and you have 1 minute left.
Oh, sorry, I will be quickly. And the another company, it's child abuse cannot be pardoned, because to rape the children, now they say children will manage with who rapes kids. And that company is going to be big, and yesterday, 40 center, I mean town and country, and we make this company. Because we know in Turkey, when you see the, I should read my notes. In pandemic time, virus, I mean, the state use against women, physically violence increasing by 18%, and psychological violence increasing 93%. Shelter demand increasing 78%, and legal support increasing 96%. And this time they closed all of the courts, and women can't apply to any courts also in home. Finally, I'm going to finish. And now we continue our struggle without a break. Our relation is the mentalist relation. Mentality relation, I mean, it's against the fascist dictator president like Trump and Recep Tayyip Erdogan will come, and women's, and finally I say, Jin Jian Azadi.
Thank you very much for that.
I think my English is not enough.
I think it was so great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot has come up in Ayse's talk. I think we can comfortably say the running theme is the state wants to kill everything for money. And I think that I haven't really heard it put that simply and that straightforwardly for a long time. And also just, you know, for this, for as probably some of our listeners will know, during the peak of a global pandemic, the Turkish state launched an entirely new military operation against Syria. And so while a pandemic was going on, that is one of the biggest things that the Turkish state used the pandemic was for more war. And
also, I can say one word, I am sorry. And we have a refugees plan, because they divide the Kurdistan in 4 parts, and half our family in Syria, and half our family in Iraq, and it's a northwest and South Kurdistan. And because when they attack any part of Kurdistan, it means attack us in North Kurdistan. Yes.
So yeah, so sorry, I meant the entirely new military operation in Iraq that the Turkish state has launched, and also furthered its military presence and essentially occupation in also places like Libya and other places. So Turkey is one of the example states that has used the global pandemic for more war. But I just want to remind people who are watching us that you can ask your questions whether you're on the Zoom call or also if you're watching on the YouTube live stream. While that is happening, I wanted to ask our speakers, maybe everyone can turn their cameras on right now, all of our speakers. I wanted to ask, and maybe we can do a round again of, you know, this call has been a very important session in discussing and demonstrating the necessary critiques that we have had, particularly surrounding capitalism in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, but also general systematic critiques that have been long-standing. But I think it would be good if each of our speakers could do 2 or 3 minutes on, you know, based on these critiques, you know, what are the alternatives and resistances like international struggles are proposing. And maybe we'll do the same order again. So maybe we'll go with you, Harsha. So, you know, maybe 2 or 3 minutes of, you know, the alternatives and the resistances that are happening right now.
Sure, thank you. Such an important question. In terms of, you know, in terms of the alternatives, you know, this may seem trite, but I think Maryanne was making an incredibly important point. I mean, all of us were, but really the ways in which Maryanne underscored that we need a complete revolutionary change, right? We need to completely dismantle capitalism. We need to dismantle the nation state and all of the forms of violence that underpin it. And so in terms of resistance, you know, this looks different in different places. I'll just speak to my context, and there's revolutionary struggles everywhere, and they take different forms in terms of democratic, feminist, egalitarian revolutions. I think in North America right now, we're of course in a moment where Black-led struggles calling for abolition are incredibly important. And I think, you know, what's especially important to keep in mind about struggles for abolition is that they're not limited to abolishing the police. They're really calling on us to think about the abolition of all carceral institutions, which includes police, prisons, you know, temporary foreign worker programs, the military, and just all of the ways in which state violence and racial capitalism are informed through each other. So I think the abolitionist struggle, if we understand it in this expansive way, is really grounding here in North America, but of course with effects all around the world. And then also right now in Canada, there's many other social movements, but I'll mention a few more. The other is really Indigenous-led struggles against settler colonialism that are very similarly, you know, people often, and we often kind of pigeonhole struggles based on identity, right? So Indigenous struggles are seen as quote unquote Indigenous struggles for Indigenous people, but really these are expansive struggles forcing us to contend with the reality of settler colonialism as it continues to underwrite violence in the world. Indigenous struggles are, of course, really at the forefront of calling for revisioning how we live in this planet on the brink of ecological devastation and in climate crisis. So what does it mean to live in a way that's in relationship to the land and that's based in stewardship on land? And as we know, Indigenous people around the world are, 5% of the world's population, but steward over 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so Indigenous struggles against settler colonialism and extractivism are so key to imagining a different relationship. And I think connected to movements that are land-based, from my perspective, they're deeply feminist. They're almost inherently feminist, right? Because we know that one of the primary struggles against patriarchy and specifically against patriarchal capitalism was the relationship that was destroyed, as Camille was talking about, between women in the land and particularly women in labor, right? So the ways in which patriarchy has forced and distorted a relationship to land and labor, particularly when it comes to care work and social reproduction. For me, I think stewardship of land, particularly Indigenous-led struggles, really recenters a feminist and land-based economy. So I think, there's so much more struggles against borders, struggles against prisons, but I think I'll just leave it at that in terms of forms of resistance that we see and the kinds of expansive visions that they're forcing us to contend with.
Thank you very much for that, Harsha. I'm going to pass on to you, Camille. I want to, because, you covered so much ground in your talk, but I think a part of the focus was, an important focus was, care, education, but also food. And, this is, I suppose that this needs an ecological approach. So, it would be really nice to hear from you of like ecological alternatives and resistances that you probably are engaged with at the moment.
Yeah, certainly. I wanted to pick up this question around land, actually, because I think when we talk about food distribution and food production in the UK, we need to start making people more familiar or more comfortable with thinking around food sovereignty, because at the moment, the UK is about 2 days away from starving, which is what we saw during the pandemic. And that's an interesting question here. I didn't grow up here. I grew up somewhere that Britain invaded a couple of 100 years ago and totally changed the land, the system and relationship to land, much like Canada. And we're pretty much involved in that story themselves. So here, I think it's a really interesting question. And it's one that the left hasn't grappled with for a really long time in a honest way, is the aristocratic class, i.e. the people who were responsible for invading places like Canada and Australia, are still here and still own 70% of the land in the UK. So when we think about food, and how we might be able to have more control over food, how we might be being one of the most exploitative, dangerous and harmful jobs, we really need to basically expropriate the land from those who have inherited it and been gifted it simply through the time of their birth. And that's a pretty big conversation to start in the UK. And it seems like this would be one of the few opportunities to start talking about that in a kind of sustainable and in a way that kind of acknowledges the kind of historical process that has led us to here today, in terms of how will the working class get more power in this moment? And there's lots of different strategies and ideas around that. But I think for people who live in Britain, a total reorientation unquestionably fundamentally crucial. We've come out of 10 years of the Conservative government abandoning certain populations, so that we have a huge amount of people who are already relying on food banks and charity to be able to survive. And we have an agricultural sector that is ununionized and a total, for want of a better word, in total crisis as a result of kind of labour conditions there. I was just reading on the news that there's been an outbreak of COVID cases in another farm in the north. And we're going to keep seeing this in terms of how the pandemic continues and on whose bodies it continues and who it involves, in terms of these questions of whose safety is important and whose lives get to continue. And I think that relates to the care, actually. And I think it relates to the question of care through no longer being able to think about things like food and care and life-sustaining activity as this thing in the background. Bringing it center stage way, it's just about us getting a break from our kids and the schooling system being there so that we can go out and work. So I think the opportunity exists to start to take away some of the things that felt really cemented into kind of capitalist ideology in the UK. The UK is one of the motherland of all of those ideas. And so I think for us in the UK, we've been presented with a unique opportunity to come back to some really fundamental questions that we have to take, and it's going to feel different, I think, and some of the questions that arise kind of feel different than what we've been grappling with before. But care can't just be about ensuring that certain people are able to go out and sell their labour power in the labour market and make other people responsible. We can't abandon our elderly and come up with this dehumanized context where some people's lives matter and some people's lives don't. And that's something that Black struggle has been constantly putting on the agenda for years now in terms of this question around value and life. And I think that this pandemic has illustrated some of the deep injustices and violences that exist around these intersections around value and life. And it's our opportunity to kind of seize them and make good with them something more than just the kind of liberal narrative that's out there at the moment about getting us back to some kind of good normal, or having some people actually survive this process at the expense of others.
Thank you very much for that, Camille. So Maryanne, the question that we're asking everyone is, you know, we've put together and demonstrated a very important and good critique, particularly of capitalism in the coronavirus context, but also, of course, more broadly, and like what the pandemic has, of course, brought to the surface. So the critique of that, I think, has been demonstrated by all four speakers very importantly. But we thought if maybe a 2 or 3 minute intervention on, you know, after this critique, you know, in a way, like what next, as in like what are the alternatives and the resistances that are happening, that struggles are proposing. Maryanne, are you with us? You are muted. Oh.
Yeah. Yes, I can say one way that we are organizing. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, we are together. So,
with us?
Yeah, we are together. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So one way we are doing to resist as women here in Kenya, we are doing political classes session to the community. We also doing art, and the kind of art that we draw, it connects the struggle of the people in that community. For example, if the issue of that community is the issue of gender-based violence or the issue of police brutality and execution, we try to draw an art that connects the struggle of the people. Another thing that we also do, we're doing food sovereignty as a way that can make society to have self-reliance, so as to walk out of the NGOs, because you do not need them. So how does the community make sure that it has that self-reliance? Is by having food sovereignty, where we take the public spaces, we farm our own food, that is our own indigenous food, seedlings, not the GMO. Yeah, so and currently the other day, last week on 7th, I think it's even this week, on 7th, last week on Tuesday, we did a march. It was People's March that we tried to connect our struggle, both the LGBTIQ community, having in the women, sex workers, people with disability, prisoners. We all march together, where at the end of the day, because the capitalist system is always afraid when people are organizing, what they had to do, they had to send so many police that I even got arrested. So on Sabasaba Day, we got arrested 53 comrades. Then we later on released on cash bail. So we are not going to give up. We are not going to relent. We are going to continue fighting until we have socialism in this country. Yeah.
That's a beautiful sentence to end on, Maryanne. Thank you so much for that. And so, Ayse, I wanted to ask the same question to you. You know, we've done the critique. what are the alternatives and the resistances that struggles are proposing right now? And perhaps you can give an answer a bit more with a focus on, you know, internationalism, because you spoke about that in your talk, and the concept of common struggle that you were also speaking about.
Yes, all of the world, in the world, what we need, like a woman and woman organization in the world. In North Kurdistan and Turkey, we see when we organize each other, more we can protect each other also. And it's an example in our life. Now we can call all of the world, really solidarity keeps us alive. We see, and in practice, we see it. And when we organize it, first of all, we should organize it in home, in neighbor, and in city, in country, in neighbor country. And if we organize each other, we can protect each other under the border also. And now we need a woman democratic confederal, discuss now. We need it because we see everything is man. I mean, state is man, policeman, soldier. Now in Kurdistan, there are many paramilitary power in Kurdistan, like a Jit, Bekchi. You see, and all of them attack the woman. And now how we protect each other in this paramilitary power? And Recep Tayyip, even AKP and MHP fascist coalition in Turkey, and they have a special strategy for to attack the woman. They have special strategy because to kill woman, you see, I mean, all of the system, if woman can not be in control, that system can't, continue also. Like an imperator and like a king, and like we know many systems. And now they want to, they use this pandemic. I say capitalist is man and pandemic man. You know, when they use pandemic, they use against the woman and put in and close the door. And women should take like a role of service in home. And why I say the pandemic is man? Oh, of course, pandemic is right, and we know, but when they use, which I called all of the women, please, we need solidarity and organize each other, because man ideology, it's in organization, like a state, like a factory, like everything, and they are in organization. If we can't organize each other, we can't protect each other also. And finally, I want to say, if a woman shouldn't not be in organized, it means they will kill us every time. Our target should be, if a woman without organization, our struggle will continue. And solidarity keeps us alive, because in Kurdistan we have food, we have water, we are rich, we haven't anything, but people is poor. Now then in Africa say no water, no, we have everything, but they control everything, and they make a poor society, want to make a society poor. And so in solidarity, of course, I believe democratic socialism in this time against the capitalist modernity, and special woman, if woman is not free, world can't be free. Jin Jian Azadi, thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Ayse. I think I suppose it's a very important phrase or slogan to begin to wrap up this incredible session, that solidarity keeps us alive. And I think that means a lot of things and can mean even more things. And yeah, I think, we've covered from the imperialism and the fascism of the existence of borders, the insecurity and the precarity of particularly migrant workers, and what Harsha addressed as, guest workers that are always deportable, to, of course, the increased violence against women, and at that, where many women have been stuck in violent situations that have been exacerbated, of course, by lockdowns in basically most of the world, and therefore how I think Camille tied really well the violent institution that is the nuclear family, and that also the home is not always a safe haven. It is perhaps for many people, but also it isn't for many people too. And therefore the very importance of revolutionary politics around care and education, and also the organizing of women and women as laborers, particularly so one woman's labor is not used just for just for a middle class woman's career. So if we're not all free, and if we're not all organized, then we need to make that standard practice that no one is. And also, Maryanne, thank you very much for sharing the experience of your context, especially around evictions, around forcing us to think about what even online education means, when there's many parts of the world that don't have either access to internet or the devices to be able to make use of those. And I think what Ayse ended on about, actually our lands, many of the lands that we live around and on are rich, but the state control and the state exploitation of these is what causes people to be poor. And I think the more we realize that actually there is a richness around us, and what we need to do is, what many people spoke about, again, Maryanne spoke about, food sovereignty and so on, and actually developing a politics of being able to regain some of these spaces, to be able to actually make sure the people that are there, and the people that definitely and genuinely deserve the richness of those lands, can actually use them to, in some cases, simply keep alive. So thank you so much for our speakers. Thank you, Harsha. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Maryanne. And thank you, Ayse. Thank you to all of our friends who no one has seen, but behind the scenes have been frantically texting in a group chat and making sure everything runs smoothly. So thank you very much. And may I mention that it's all women behind the scenes to make this happen as well. So thank you very much to all the women that made sure that this session was happening and that it was running smoothly. So the live stream the live stream and the video of this session will be on our YouTube page. It's YouTube /Women Weaving Future. So anyone who's been listening, any of our speakers, feel free to share this around for people who may not have been able to join us in this moment. And also I wanted to make a very quick announcement. So our next session in our webinar series is titled Feminicide and the Answer of Women's Self-Defense. And we will be very, very lucky to be joined by Ariane Rojava, a YPJ, a YPJ, so Women's Defense Unit Commander, directly from Rojava, to address this question. And, particularly the politics of women's self-defense in all areas of life. This will be next Sunday, so in exactly a week, on the 19th of July. And actually, incidentally, the anniversary of the Rojava Revolution, it'll be the 8th anniversary of the Rojava Revolution next Sunday. So that will be at 7 p.m. Central European time, that's 6 p.m. UK time, and 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, and 8 p.m. General for across the Middle East, and also where Maryanne is today as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. The video, like I said, will stay up, so please share it. And yeah, on to the next one, and we will continue to struggle together. Jinjian Azadi.